The foundational texts of the historical Buddha are filled with philosophical contradictions. Depending on the specific scripture, the Buddha either insists on a continuous self that bears moral responsibility, or he deconstructs that self into impersonal, momentary phenomena. For centuries, scholars operated on a conciliatory impulse, forcing these contradictions into a single, cohesive timeline, assuming the Buddha possessed one unified system. In his historiographical reconstruction, Giuseppe Ferraro proposes a shift from this approach. He argues that the historical Buddha intentionally engineered three theoretical modes that were logically and intentionally irreconcilable. This chart outlines Ferraro's taxonomy of those three modes. The affirmative mode defends a continuous self for moral karma. The negative mode denies the self, dissolving ego-clinging through momentary components. And the middle path strictly excludes both being and non-being. Here is a flowchart mapping Ferraro's conclusion. He posits that these three distinct pedagogical profiles naturally ossified over centuries, following a parallel descent into three isolated philosophical schools. While this parallel model offers a logic for the philosophical contradictions, it doesn't account for the physical reality of ancient India. It assumes these ideas developed in pristine intellectual silos, rather than the resource-starved reality of actual monastic institutions. Sociologist Joseph Waler shifts the focus away from pure philosophy and toward institutional survival. When the focus moves to material evidence, the parallel history collapses. The historical flaw in Ferraro's model is infrastructure. Early Mahayanists, the champions of the Middle Register, did not possess their own independent monasteries. They existed as a marginalized minority, physically living inside the established host monasteries run by the affirmative and negative schools. These host monasteries were governed by Vinaya, strict monastic law. Preaching unauthorized contradictory doctrines risked the legal charge of schism. The penalty for schism was immediate expulsion and the loss of all material support. To survive inside a hostile host without triggering expulsion, the practitioners of the Middle Register could not rely on parallel evolution. They had to execute a parasitic survival strategy. In biology, avian brood parasitism is a strategy where bird species thrive by manipulating the labor of others. The European cuckoo is the prime example. The cuckoo does not rear its own young. Instead, the female lays her eggs directly into the nests of other species, pawning the cost of parenting entirely onto foster parents. For this to succeed, the mimicking egg must closely resemble the host's eggs. If the physical pattern deviates, the host recognizes the intrusion and abandons the nest. The ancient Indian monastery operated like a biological host nest. It was fortified by conservative Vinaya laws that dictated exactly what texts were legal to copy, recite, and preserve. Early Mahayana texts acted as mimicking eggs, bypassing this legal firewall. They cloaked radical new doctrines in the host's accepted rhetorical style, splicing together older authoritative scriptures to pass their new sutras off as Buddhavacana, the legal word of the Buddha. This created a legal trap. If a text successfully mimicked the grammatical standards and rhetorical markers of Buddhavacana, the host's own Vinaya laws mandated that they tolerate and incubate it. This precise textual camouflage allowed a minority philosophy to safely embed itself directly into the heart of a conservative institution. Once the biological mimicking egg hatches, the cuckoo check operates purely on blind instinct to eliminate all competition. The blind chick instinctively shoves over the edge any solid object that it contacts within the nest. This biological ejection mechanism directly mirrors the activation of Nagarjuna's philosophical masterpiece, the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, within the host monastery. The solid objects in the host monastery were their foundational metaphysical beliefs. For the Pudgalavada, this was a continuous self. For the Abhidharma, it was the existence of atomic fundamental particles called dharmas. Madhyamaka functions as the ejection mechanism through shunyata, or emptiness. It is not a new, solid theory, but a demonstration that inherent existence leads to logical contradiction. This pure epoche, a suspension of judgment, refuses both affirmative real entities and negative atomic particles. By systematically dismantling the host's views without ever positing a positive, prosecutable doctrine of their own, Mahayanists evaded the legal charge of heresy. Madhyamaka epoche functioned as a jurisprudential loophole that hollowed out the host's doctrines entirely from the inside. The biological aftermath of this parasitism is tragicomic. With their rightful eggs gone, the foster parents are free to devote all their care to the parasite. The small foster parents work like Sisyphus, undertaking the exhausting task of trying to keep up with the appetite of an outsized chick. Returning to the material reality of the Indian monastery, text preservation required physical resources. It demanded human labor, vast quantities of pens, paper, ink, and designated physical storage space. Because the Mahayana texts successfully bypassed the legal firewall of the Vinaya, they became the official property of the monastery. The host monks, bound by their own duties, were legally forced to recite, copy, and physically preserve these parasitic texts in perpetuity. Conservative scholars expended vast amounts of their own institutional labor to reproduce an anti-metaphysical philosophy that actively destroyed their life's work. Mahayana triumphed because it successfully hijacked the material infrastructure of its rivals. Philosophically, Ferraro's claim holds true. The Buddha's three theoretical registers are logically and irreconcilably distinct. The middle way's pure void cannot be peacefully harmonized with affirmative personalism or negative determinism. This chart maps the ideal assumption that these ideas solidified into completely separate, unconnected institutional silos. But these traditions actually co-evolved through institutional friction and shared physical spaces. The middle register survived by feeding off the material resources of the other two schools. The radical anti-metaphysical epoche, the philosophical void of the middle register, could never have survived without a host infrastructure to physically maintain its texts. It endured only because it successfully hacked the monastic law of the exact metaphysical schools it sought to destroy. Through these strategies, the middle way successfully converted its rivals' institutional labor into a mechanism for its own preservation. The architect of the Madhyamaka hack secured the transmission of his ideas across millennia without ever laying a single brick of his own monastery. The survival of Buddhism's most rigorous philosophy was a calculated triumph of institutional biology.